All right, should we get going? How you guys doing? Yeah, you sure about that? All right, so I only have one rule. I try and just stick to one rule in my sessions. Please put your phone on vibrate, okay? If your phone goes off, you usually travel in pairs, so if your phone goes off, I'm going to have you pass it down to people, and they're going to answer your phone for you if we hear it ring, okay? You probably don't want that because you don't know who's sitting two doors down from you, all right? So please, just an appreciation for other people. If you need to take a call, no worries, just go outside. All right, so welcome. I think this is a really exciting time, not only for SharePoint Online, but for SharePoint as well, when Windows and Azure and SharePoint come together. You've obviously seen some announcements at the keynote this week and some kind of inroads, I think, with these two technologies coming together. And today we'll kind of dig into how SharePoint Online and Windows Azure come together to help build hybrid apps. Now, just let me take a couple of poll questions here. First of all, how many of you are developers out there? Okay, roughly 40%. How many of you have actually built an Azure app? Not a lot. Okay, cool. So I will assume that the three of you who have built them understand the new project, how to get there. Others don't. We'll kind of start out there and make our way up to the 300 level. My name is Steve Fox. I work for Microsoft. I run a group of worldwide architects and developers. We have fun talking about Azure, and obviously these days are very, very busy in and around SharePoint and SharePoint Online. We're having a lot of customer conversations around how we integrate these two technologies. So here's my agenda. Cover some fundamentals, talk through some scenarios, and then I'm going to close out. Okay, pretty simple. I'll make my slides available in the next 24 hours on my blog, and you should be able to get them as a download off the TechEd site at some point in time soon as well. So no worries. If you absolutely need them right away, you can come up and get them, but otherwise you'll have them at your fingertips soon. Goals of this session. So I think I really want to provide a holistic view of how SharePoint Online and Windows Azure integrate. Now, if you're looking for me to get in the guts of the client object model, and get in the guts of all the different kind of object model APIs of SharePoint, I'm going to focus more on kind of how the two integrate and talk a bit about, hey, creating a REST service or a WCF service. How does JSON fit in? And what's the architecture look like as we walk through some of these scenarios? I think that's where we're at as kind of a community. And certainly happy to take deeper questions and concerns offline and talk with you there. But these generally is where I'm going to stick at. The demo scenarios will integrate the two technologies here. And, of course, hopefully the goal is after this session, you'll have a starting point. You'll understand how some of these things fit together. So you can go away, get your free trial of Windows Azure, and begin to play around in the context of SharePoint Online and Windows Azure. So let's start out talking about some fundamentals. First of all, right out of the gate, what is a hybrid application? This is my definition. There is no formal, standards-based body that defines hybrid apps that I know of. Do you guys know of any standard body that defines what a hybrid app is? No. So in my mind, this is what it is. SharePoint Online plus data code logic that lives kind of elsewhere. And when we talk about hybrid apps, a lot of times we're talking about kind of lob data. So we'll do a little bit of lob data. And I also include in this remote clients and devices. Because really we are talking about, in the context of SharePoint Online and Windows Azure, we're all talking about bringing together multiple worlds into kind of this cloud-based application. And I think it's an exciting time for Office 365. One thing we don't talk a lot about as a company, and I don't know why, we're a little too hesitant, is our story vis-a-vis our competitors. I think we have a very strong story when we start to look at Office 365 and SharePoint Online and Azure coming together. You have a good out-of-the-box story, and you have a good platform story to integrate a lot of different facets and services of Windows Azure into SharePoint Online. But loosely defined, this is hybrid apps, and this is the frame for what we'll use today. I wanted to also just kind of give you a glimpse. When we think about Windows Azure, what is this thing? What is this platform? You hear a lot about the Cloud OS. You hear a lot about all the different features, and there's tons of Azure sessions here. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but I thought it would help for you just to have a snapshot view of what's generally available right now and what's in the spring preview that you've been hearing about, again, in the keynotes and certainly in other sessions this week. You can see the top level here, all the clients that can consume what invariably is a bunch of services. Okay? These services could be things like media services, could be big data services, could be all sorts of different types of services that you as a developer or an IT pro can take advantage of when building your solutions. So you could think, if I have SharePoint Online kind of sitting atop there as one of my clients, I could literally reach in, build apps that leverage different parts of that platform. Okay? I could build, for an example, a learning solution that leverages media services, which is basically allows me to, automate workflow around encoding and transcoding and doing things like that. I could literally, take my SharePoint Online site, plug it into PaaS applications, have a REST service that consumes. And you'll find that that's going to be a common pattern that you'll build. A WCF or RESTified service of some sort that mediates data or proxies into your SharePoint Online site. Okay? Now, before I go any further, who here has heard of a sandbox solution in SharePoint Online? Quite a few of you, right? And for those that haven't, sandbox solution is just kind of this sandbox inside of SharePoint Online that allows you to build apps. But one key restriction that we're talking about that it doesn't allow you to do is kind of reach outside of that sandbox and make external calls, right? So I can't really make an external call out to a service or a data connection string, which is kind of restrictive. That's one of the key elements in the cloud. You want to be able to kind of reach around and do stuff and mash up, right? Without just resorting to an iframe, which is kind of boring, right? Want to do exciting stuff, build services, right? Services. So the point is, we'll talk a bit about getting around the sandbox solution today, and you'll see some common patterns where we use things like, Silverlight and jQuery and JavaScript and things like that, again, but with that service kind of sitting at the heart of it to mediate things across. Anyways, kind of got a little off tangent there. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. This is just so as you think about SharePoint and Windows Azure coming together, there's three facets of this story. There's infrastructure as a service, which you could think of kind of as server and virtual machines in the cloud. There's platform as a service. This, to me, is one of the most interesting parts of Windows Azure. And right now, it's kind of been overrun by the IaaS story, the virtual machine story. But as developers, don't forget about that middle part. There's so much power there. So many things that you can take advantage of, especially when we talk about SharePoint Online. And of course, the SaaS side, that's the out-of-the-box stuff. You go to a Microsoft Online site, you provision a SharePoint Online site, the world is a happy place. And that's out-of-the-box stuff. But again, you can integrate that with device, services, and all sorts of goodness. But this, to me, is the strongest story that we've had in the Microsoft history of SharePoint Online, even though it's not that old. The cloud's coming together in a very nice way for these two areas. So 4 scenarios. What I'm going to cover. I'm going to cover data synchronization. What that means, you've got data, lob data here, potentially on premises. We're going to take it into the cloud through this thing called data synchronization. This is both a developer and an IT pro scenario, so you can both kind of follow along. Consuming services, this we get into a little bit of code. Okay, and so for the non-developers, I'll try and explain them, but just expect that we will run through some code, okay? And this will be, again, where we've got things like business connectivity services, WCF. I'll even show a little bit of REST. Service bus is really interesting. Then what we'll do, the third one, is we'll take a device app. In this case, we'll use Windows Phone 7, and we'll connect that to a SharePoint artifact of some sort. It'll be data that lives in the cloud, and you'll be able to serve that up, okay? And then lastly, we'll actually dive into the Azure Virtual Machine, and we'll use IaaS for just some solution extensibility. So you'll see me kind of reach back into my server over here that's sitting on premises by virtue of a service that sits in the cloud and serve up information that's, basically a remote virtual machine. Okay? All told, these are kind of 4 hybrid scenarios, but these patterns that you'll be able to take from these 4 areas, you'll be able to cross-apply in a lot of different ways. Okay? Some of them easier, but some of these have restrictions. So, for example, data synchronization, we're talking about SQL Server to SQL database in the cloud. Okay? So you have to match schemas and things like that. Services, for the developers, that's much more flexible. You build your own models. You can define how you interact with data, blah-de, 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 blah. Okay? Guys excited? Oh my, that's so lame. Are we excited? Yes. These are the 4 scenarios we'll talk about. So let's talk about data synchronization. What I try and do is I try and follow a common format. We'll walk through the architecture so you all know what I'm trying to do. Then I'll walk through a demo that actually takes it and puts it into practice. Okay? So what does the architecture of the demo that I'm going to show you look like? Here we have on the left-hand side our lob. On the right-hand side we have our SQL database, which is a database that sits in Windows Azure. The question becomes, how can we take data from point A, which is on premises, and get it to data in point B, which is in the cloud? Now this is important, right? Because again, if we're thinking about Europe, one of the key things we have to think about here is restricting certain data types from living in the cloud. Okay? So the interesting thing about this model is I can filter on certain data types and data elements within my schema from on-premises to only expose a subset of that in the cloud, that's why this is kind of interesting, right? And so how we do that is we have this thing called SQL Azure Data Sync, or SQL Data Sync, I think is the more recent name with some of the branding changes. But the point is, there's an agent that basically mediates my kind of relationship with my on-premises SQL server, and it says, hey, guy over here, I'm going to synchronize with you because you're calling me and you want to synchronize with me, and I've got local credentials, it's all secure, and again, the world is happy. And so what happens is with these 2 agents, one living in the cloud and one living on premises, they have this connection between them, this conversation, this secure handshake, and data from over here gets pushed out and now lives over here. Okay? And then, of course, we follow the animation, which is very exciting. We follow the animation. Don't miss it. There it goes. The point is, we can then use this data for other things. And this is where later on I'll incorporate a REST service to a device. That'll be the 3rd scenario. But this, in essence, is kind of lying at the crux. You can take data that lives on SQL Server, have this agent, expose it out to the cloud, and then leverage it in different ways. It can be leveraged in SharePoint Online, as we'll see. It can be leveraged in things like, a phone app. But the point is, you have this hybrid app. Okay? Yes, sir? Are they on? Are they off? That's okay. Sorry, go ahead. No, it's basically a special version that you get when you sign up for. The question was, sorry, is it a special version? Basically what this is, when you sign up for Windows Azure, and I'll show you in just a sec where you can find it, you go into the data sync portion. It walks you through this wizard. You download this agent onto your local server that you want to synchronize. Okay? So let's walk through it. Better yet than killing you with slides. Okay. So for those of you who have never engaged in Windows Azure, and for the 4 of you that have, for the 4 that have, congratulations. Welcome to the club. The rest of you, come on over. It's fun. Maybe not. So this is the Windows Azure portal. So when you sign up, you'll engage with this portal on a fairly regular basis. Okay? If we jump in and just kind of jump to the top here, there's an HTML5 version of this, because you can basically see that's what it's showing in the keynotes. HTML5 version is a Silverlight version. If you've been using the Silverlight version and you just don't want to run away from it, it's going to be supported, I think, for about 6 months to a year. So you still have some time, okay, while they're kind of building all the features into the HTML5 version. But basically, you could think of, here's my point of manageability. Okay, one of the core tenets of the cloud is self-service. Well, this is your port of entry for self-service. This is how I manage my virtual machines. This is how I manage my cloud services. And you can see a whole bunch of cloud services I have here. I can manage my applications, my websites, my SQL databases, all of that good stuff. If we go down here, I believe it's in the School of Fine Arts, maybe? Is that where I've got this? No, I can't recall where. But it's one of the databases here that you'll see. Maybe it's TechEd. That might be it there. Anyways, you can see you got a view here. We can go ahead and open this up in a new tab. And that allows me to take a look at the data. The point is, we've got all these different features and ways of managing the activities that you're engaged in within Windows Azure. Now, specifically, if you're looking to do data sync, it's still in the old portal. You can see here down the left-hand side, there's this place called Data Sync. You click that. And what you can do is basically walk through the process of building out a sync group. Okay? And that's what this process I went through. There's a great hands-on lab in the Windows Azure training kit that walks through in a very prescriptive way how to do this. Okay? So just to save some time here, I built one out. But in essence, you go here. You can go into a particular subscription. You click Create. That can walk you through, how you go about setting this up. And you can add a SQL Azure database. You can add a SQL Server database. You can select the ways in which they integrate and the schema. So here you can see I've set one up. Let's go back here, TechEd EU. Yes, I want to discard the changes. You can see that I've got a database in the cloud talking to a database on premises. You can see that I've got TechEd. You can see the CEA 1.4 blah-de-blah-de-blah, and you can see the bottom one there. The agents, that's the little good thing, right? That's the little check mark. That's agent over here on premises being able to talk to agent in the cloud. So right now I could synchronize, and the data that I push from on premises would end up in the cloud. Okay? So for example here, let's go ahead and sync now. What that would do is, as you can see here, let's go Control 4. You can see that's kind of synchronizing. It's taking my data from on-premises, moving it into the cloud. So in essence, I've created this connection. I'm managing it. Okay? Now, I'm not sure if there's an API that sits behind this for the developers. I mean, a lot of what I've done here is basically through the portal, right? If you go back here, and I'll go into my SQL Server instance here, you can see that this is kind of the data that sits inside of my SQL Server. It's fairly simple. But imagine you had this complex SQL Server database. You wanted to expose some information. The key that I want to do here is you can see I've got employee ID. In some places, that's classified as PII, personally identifiable information, right? You shouldn't be putting that type of information in the cloud, okay? And so the question then becomes, all right, I've set up this synchronization between my on-premises and cloud instance. How do I filter that one column out when I'm trying to bridge these two data sources? And so if you go back to our data sync here, you can see that, great, it's good, it's synchronized. But one thing I didn't show you here is over here on the right-hand side. Okay? This is where, in essence, what I can do is map the schema, and they have to be mapped by data type. If there's any mismatch, you'll get this error, and I'll be like, I can't synchronize because you've got an nvar 50 over here trying to map it to an int over here. Okay? So data types have to match. All right? Go over here, edit the data set. And here you can see that I've got DBO speakers for my on-premises instance, but I've actually unchecked the employee column. Okay, and what that will do, it'll expose everything around the employee ID, that same kind of information, but it won't take the employee ID column and copy that out and synchronize that. Okay. So again, for countries like Germany, I know there's fairly restrictive policies around data that can be exposed. So that's one way, I guess, of circumventing that. But it gives you a little more control, again, over what you can synchronize with and what you can keep on premises. And then, of course, there's a couple different ways to digest it. If we go over here, let me see, into our School of Fine Arts. I'll come back to this a little later on and actually walk through how you do this. But this is just a grades example. Here what we can do, this grades example is actually interacting against a SQL database site. So the point is I can take data, I can push it out into the cloud, and I can filter it and expose it to, let's say, students or other audiences. And here you can imagine if I was moving like student data, I probably wouldn't want to put their student IDs or their social security numbers or whatever the equivalent is in the different countries here in Europe into the cloud. So I can filter all that information out. Now, one of the third demo I'll walk you through is actually how you would build the wrapper service around this to expose it in SharePoint Online. Okay? So first step here is we've just kind of synchronized the data. Later on in our session, we'll show you how you wrap it and expose it. Okay? And it's not just here that you can expose it. You can also expose it in, I think this is it here, my RESTful phone app. And I'll walk through how you create this later on. But I'll just create this here and kind of run it for you. because this is actually running against that speaker SQL database, that we've got in the cloud. And so what we should see when this thing runs is we should see this very fancy TechEd app. Very fancy indeed, right? Years of training, graphical training to get there. You can go down here and you can see that it's kind of just synchronize all my stuff here. Okay? And so in essence what that represents is data that's coming from on-premises. You can expose it in SharePoint Online. But because you have this central database, wrap a service around it, you can now expose it out to SharePoint Online, to devices. It's this whole world of abstracting out. Okay? Does that make sense? Any questions on what I just showed you? Yes, sir? Right now, it's only SQL Server. Now, I don't know if there's plans to, broaden that out, because as you know, we support other, MySQL and whatnot in the cloud. So I imagine they're thinking it over, but no formal announcement or plans have been announced that I'm aware of. I'm not aware. We can talk offline if you want to email me. I'll get you some more information, okay? Okay. So that was the first demo, okay? Let's go back to the slides. And you could see that, the IT Pro-ish part of it comes in because you're managing a portal, and obviously developers kind of living in code, right? So there's definitely a meshing of those two worlds there. Now, the process, just to kind of recapitulate what the process was that I went through to show you what I did. I replicated the schema from SQL Server to what is now SQL Database, so I apologize, my branding isn't up to speed here. I installed the data sync agent on my server, my SQL Server box. I would then registered the SQL Server data sync with my guy in the cloud so they can connect. And basically, there's a generation of an encrypted key that you put on the server, so that allows you to communicate across. I made sure that my schema was matching. Again, if they don't match, they won't talk. And then I surfaced that data. You saw me, I just showed you a quick SharePoint Online, but I'll show you again a little later on how we go about doing that in much greater detail. In fact, I think in the next session I talk all about services, and you can expose it out via service or REST. Okay? So let's take a turn away from data and talk about services, because when we talk about SharePoint Online, we talk about customization, you will be living and breathing services, more than likely. Okay? A, because the out-of-the-box business connectivity services, which is how you tie SQL database data to your SharePoint Online site. What mediates that? Anybody can tell me? I know you know. What mediates that? It's a WCF service, right? And so you put that WCF service in the middle. That's the thing that you'll be calling to get that data back. But more than likely, again, it's not just SQL database. You could have other data on the other side of that. It could be any type of REST endpoint that you're just trying to wrap and model to pull that into your SQL Azure or SQL or SharePoint Online site. Okay? So I'm going to show you a couple demos. The first one's going to be relatively easy. We'll use Silverlight. It will have a service. It'll talk to an external data system, which is going to be Windows Azure Data Market. Okay, that's the first one. The second one is going to be more complex. I'll have a service bus relay, which is going to be interesting, right? Because I have data on my on-premises lob system that I'm actually going to throw across a message channel that has a secure relay service that sits in the cloud, right? And so it's a little more complex. All right, but I'm going to show you two types of services here. All right, and so in essence, what we're going to do is we're going to build a service. We're going to deploy it to Windows Azure. That deployed service is going to talk to another system, bring it in, and expose it to SharePoint Online via a Silverlight app. Okay? Now, can anybody tell me why I'm using a Silverlight app? I told you this before, right? The sandbox solution. You kind of have to go and use the client a little more because the sandbox solution restrictions. Again, why? Because you can't make those external service calls. But with jQuery and JavaScript and Silverlight, I can make external service calls and use the client object model as an intermediary to either push or pull from SharePoint Online. Okay? Make sense? So that's kind of the pattern. It's kind of a bummer. You could also use iframe if you wanted to, and use some messaging across the iframes. That could be another thing that you could do. But in essence, this is what I'm going to show you here first. And in the spirit of really cool animated stuff, I'm going to move a little box which represents data around my slide. And there we go. And it's nice because, again, with the service model, it's not just about serving it into SharePoint Online, but we're abstracting that we can project out to our devices. Okay? Oh, how fancy. Come on. All right. So first of all, Data Market. What is Data Market? So datamarket.azure.com, you can go there today with a live ID and get yourself set up with an account. It's free. Don't charge you anything at all. It's very interesting because what you can do with the Data Market is you can actually subscribe to data. Now, in the spirit of showing, demos, I often subscribe to free data sources, right? So there's things that you can do that don't cost you anything, all right? So one of those data sources, if you go down here, is this data.gov data source here, all right? It allows me to click on that bad boy. And basically, you can see that when you click on it, you can see you've got different options to ingest that data. So imagine, in our world of hybrid apps, that this is my quote-unquote lob data. Subscription data, could be weather data, could be anything. This is my lob data, and my service is going to pull it in and expose it in my SharePoint Online site. All right, so I'm going to do it programmatically. Obviously, I'm going to use Visual Studio. But, for giggles, you can actually open this up, and you can query it just to see what that data looks like. I'll just do an open query, and here you can see that, let me see here. We've got all sorts of interesting stuff. You can see that state of Alaska, population is, et cetera. Violent crime is 2,405, et cetera, et cetera. More importantly, here you can see at the top that we've got the service URL. Who knows what REST is in OData? Who's come across those concepts? A few of you. Basically, if you've not seen this, you should become familiar with it as a developer because it's becoming more and more of a standard way of programming. So here you can see that we've got this REST URI, HTTPS, whack API, Basically what that means is I can use a URI to kind of get or post, use the common verbs of the web to get data, okay? And I'll show you this a little later on. In fact, why don't I show you now what one practically looks like. Let's go back here. Boom. And here's my speaker REST data, I think. This is an example of a REST data service. I'll show you how we build it later on. But this actually interacts with the data I actually took from my on-premises SQL Server database and exposed in the cloud. Okay? But the point is, when we go ahead here and just do Control-4, I think that'll allow me to type in. We'll go speakers. There we go. We'll do that. Basically, what I'm doing here is I'm actually querying that data by virtue of a URI. Okay? For those of you who haven't come across REST, this is kind of the base concept behind it. And so essentially, if you think about how do I get there, it's just wrapping data with a REST service that allows you to kind of go ahead and interact with it this way. Okay? Right. Where was I? I think I was... where was I? Help me out. Where was I just before I took myself off track? All right. I think I was going to build the service. Oh, yeah, I was back in the data market. Here we go. So it's here. So the question then becomes, how do we take this data market, wrap it in a service, and then expose that out? Okay? So let's jump into Visual Studio. First, I'm going to open up this guy here. Visual Studio 2010, not my mail. For those of you who have never built an Azure app, basically what you first need to do is download the SDK. And once you've downloaded, you go File, New Project, click Cloud. And you'll have this type of project here. You click OK, and it gives you a bunch of options. You can see here in the options, let me do this, that I've got ASP.NET website I could build, an MVC app, I've got a service, worker role, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of different options, okay? Now what I'm going to do here is I'll build out a WCF service, add that into my cloud service, and go ahead and build that out. All right? Now what that does for me, most of you have probably built a WCF service, right? Who has built a WCF service, right? Lots of you. All we're doing here is saying, hey, you know that plumbing we typically build with a service right there on the right-hand side? There's this other wrapper project. Okay, and the wrapper project is basically a configuration file that takes your service and says, hey, I'm going to put it over here in a data center. Where you want me to deploy this, that's where I'm going to put it. Okay? And then then you basically run it remotely. All right? And so when you think about what that looks like, this is why I was showing you this here, because these cloud services here are WCF services or REST services that I've built and deployed and are now managing here from a remote location. So these are all in different data centers, right? Okay? And so if you go back here, you can imagine Windows Azure 3. If I want to publish this out, I will click Publish, and this will actually take me to a place where I can go ahead and just next, kind of file, next, whatever, and it'll actually deploy it directly into that portal, which again is basically a Windows Server 2008 R2 instance sitting in a data center somewhere. It's got IIS running on it, and so basically at that point you are accessing, a cross-domain service call. And so if we go ahead, I'm going to say no. Let's just jump back to my desktop here. I think I've got one or two sitting there. Sorry about that. Esri service. This is the actual service I've deployed that interacts with my data market. And you can see the namespace of the service is indeed cloudopt.net. So it's sitting in the cloud, and it's a service that I can use. Okay? So that's this guy with a wrapper service around it deployed in Windows Azure. Now the code to do that is over here. Okay? So I just went through that same process. I just showed you I file new, created a service, WCF service, but what did I do? I then took a service reference from that demographic site, and I just added it here, and I added some code to wrap around that. So let's go up here. I think this is my demographic service here. So again, you can see the plumbing. Can anybody notice something strange that I've added there to make sure I can facilitate cross-domain calls? Cross-domain.xml, right? So anytime you deploy a service into Windows Azure and it's going to be consumed by a Silverlight app, you have to do this, or it'll choke. All right? Standard stuff. Okay? And I'll go ahead and see the service here. You can see that when we open it up. It's fairly simple, right? It just takes an object called demographic, which I've defined and modeled, and pulls it into my SharePoint or my Silverlight app that I'll then expose inside of SharePoint. Didn't want to do that. Do this. Now, the question then becomes, I've deployed it. I've got a service I can reference it's pulling data back. The thing we want to do here is that we want to build a little app here that consumes it. This is my Fabricam market analysis. Very cool stuff. Again, lame-o displays and graphics, but the point is, I can take that service reference, which is this guy here, and I can begin to code against it here. Okay? You'll see down here, I've got different modes. I've got different get events and whatnot. And again, I'll post this code so you can go and see it. But it's fairly standard stuff. And I'm embarrassed to show my code because the developers in the audience, you can probably code way better than this. But the point is, you grab the data from the demographics site, from Azure Data Market, spin through it, do some goo with it, expose it in an app. Now the question then becomes, okay, fine, I've created a service. I'm consuming it in this app. What do I do with this Silverlight app? What you do then is you can do one of two things. If we think about the context of our, our SharePoint online sites. Here's my SharePoint online site. It's a fancy Fabricam demo site. You guys should be able to get a hold of this and play around with it. And what I can do is I can go in here, and go down to sales. Oh, let's just stop that for a sec. There we go. Sales. And you can see that I've just created a sales site. And inside my sales site, I've got my fancy Silverlight app. Okay, and if I go ahead and click data, that calls my service. That's deployed into Azure. That's talking to that kind of data market guy out there and pulls that back in and exposes it in this Silverlight app. Okay, and you can see here that there's interaction within the app. I click on a particular county. That reshapes the graphs and tells me, gives me a graphical analysis of the averages. Here you can see I've also taken that data and mapping it in Bing Maps. Okay? Any questions on this? This is a fairly common pattern. Some of you may have seen this before. This is a fairly common pattern. We're taking Silverlight service, and we're using the Silverlight media web part. Okay? Now, the nice thing here is I can do this in the cloud in SharePoint Online. I've got a service sitting out there, but I can also do this on SharePoint on premises. Okay, here's the exact same or a very similar type. Let's go over here to demographics. It's a Silverlight app that does much the same thing. Okay, and it's calling that service but works in the exact same way. So it's portable. All right, this idea of portability is very important. And so you can see that we can do lots of different things here. All right. Any questions on that? That's a second pattern, a fairly simple pattern, but one that gets you going. Remember, it's data market data, service in between, consumed via Silverlight app, pop that in SharePoint Online or SharePoint on premises, and you're good to go. Now, interestingly, you could swap out jQuery for the Silverlight and do cross-domain calls and interact with that as well. Okay? All right. Let's move to the next one. Another fancy build. This one's a little more tricky, right? Who's here heard of the service bus in Windows Azure? A few of you. Okay, so the service bus essentially allows you, it's typically used as a messaging queue, but you can move data in small amounts across it. You can think of it as a service bus relay in reality, what it is. So here what I've got is my on-premises instance. You could think of it as any type of lob data. It could be anything that with a service wrapper. It could be SQL Server. It could be any type of database that you were talking about. I've got a listener service there that's kind of waiting to be called. It's like, hey, I'm just waiting here. Somebody play with me. And then the service bus relay is basically an authenticated secure point in Azure that allows applications to come in, call it, and then what happens is data comes from on-premises and gets shuttled out to the cloud where it can be consumed. Okay, so in effect, the hybrid model here is through this service bus relay that has an authentication mechanism to it. And then at that point, we can take that data and we can shuttle it up to a SharePoint Online site. And as I'll show you later on, we can even integrate it with an infrastructure as a service virtual machine role. Okay? Because once you've got something going, you can consume it in multiple places. All right? Again, fancy graphics. Here we go. All right. So the question then becomes, how do we go about doing this? Okay? All right, so let's go here. First of all, I'm going to open up here it is here. I'm going to open up a Visual Studio. And again, I know not everybody here is developers, so for those of you who aren't, bear with me, and don't hesitate to ask questions, okay? We don't have to live in the code. We can bump it up if you want me to, okay? So here you can see I've got a couple of apps here on the right-hand side. In essence, I've got a service that I'm going to deploy, just like I showed you. It's a WCF service I'm going to deploy into Windows Azure. I second have a listener service. It's just a kind of a listener service that's sitting on premises. And then I've got an app that's going to consume the service in the cloud and pull data from on premises and suck it back out. Okay? So for example here, if we take a look at what this service does, we can go ahead, and all this basically does, it opens up a host for us. Okay? Many of you who have coded probably know what a service host is. It's just a channel. All right? Now, more importantly, though, you can see that what this is doing in this case, there's a couple things that we can do. Here, I'm just creating a bunch of contacts and passing a list collection of those contacts or sales objects. That's all I'm doing. But you could see down here, like this is in memory, you could see down here if I wanted to, I could go ahead and interact with a SharePoint site. All right? So imagine there's my service wrapper with some GUI inside it, and that GUI could call into PeopleSoft. It could call into SAP. It can call into whatever you want. It's the service proxy. And that code there represents the abstraction point. Okay? This, I'm interacting with SharePoint, but again, you could substitute that to do other stuff. Okay? And so this is basically the workhorse behind this whole thing. Is going to take this data and serve it up. All right? So you'll see this data here being served. The first thing I have to do, though, is I have to start this service that's sitting on premises here and waiting to be called. I have to start it up. Okay? And it's going to tell me when it's ready. Now, interestingly, this is using a secure connection to my Azure Service Bus. Okay? Now, what does that mean? If we jump over here and go into my management portal and go into Service Bus, you can see here, all I've done is I've created this namespace. And the namespace sits in the service bus and allows to authenticate with it. I won't show you my credentials, but you can imagine there's a secret word and a token that you pass in, just the equivalent to a username and password that allows you to communicate across. All right? So in essence, when this guy starts up and says, hey, I'm ready to be used, somebody, reach out and talk to me, this guy here is basically communicating along that service bus relay, waiting for a service to call it. Does that make sense? I want to make sure you understand that before we go forward, because it can be kind of an abstract concept. Okay, so then we've got this guy here. What I've done is inside my project, again, I've got a Silverlight app, and you can see here that it's got a service reference. And the Silverlight app is super ugly. I'm not ashamed to admit it. And basically it's going to call in. It's going to call that service, go along the service bus relay, grab that data, pull it back across, and expose it in the cloud. Okay? Now, just for the sake of ease, I've gone in here. I believe it's on my home site. And just deployed it down the bottom here. Okay? So what we've got here is here's our on-premises Silverlight app. You say get data. What we should see here, you see that sales method to retrieve on-premises log data has been called. So what happened was the app went out to my service in the cloud, went along the service bus relay to the listener service and said, hey, I need some data. And then basically that service is going to push that data back. Okay? What's interesting about this model is you could throw data there, but it's also messaging queues, right? The messages could go out to SharePoint Online. They could go to phones. They could do whatever. So if you had workflow on your SharePoint on-premises instance, you could begin to fire stuff off out into queues using the service bus relay that's authenticated, and people could obviously react to it with given workflow. And if we go back to our site here, you'll see there's the data. And this data corresponds to the data that we obviously just showed you here. Now, of course, I could go down and say, let's go back, just to sort of prove out that this is not fake. Go back to our SharePoint calling service here. And let's just add one more. And we'll say, I don't know, Alan Shaky. And we'll just do that. We'll save it. Do that again. Debug it. Start it up. It'll say, okay, I'm going to reach out, authenticate with the service bus relay. When I'm authenticated, then I'm ready to be called. And I'll just take a sec to do that. There we go. Now it's ready. We can go back to our site here. And that was here. And we'll just refresh this guy. Go back down to the bottom. Get the data. And you should see that that new data that I just added there called WAG LLC is now there. Okay, so as additional data is being added to your log site, you can expose it out via this relay service. Okay? Any questions on this particular pattern? Yes, sir?
Do I have to modify my WCF service on premise to get connected to the service bus? Is there any code to add?
Well, the code, there's code that you have to add to configure it. Right, and the code that you saw here, right? So the question was, do I have to do any custom code? And the short answer is yes, right? And there's a couple different elements of the custom code that you have to do. So here on the right-hand side, I don't want to do that. On the right-hand side, I've got this service, and inside the service, I've got two things that are important. I've got the configuration. I won't open this up because then you'll see my stuff, but they've got configuration, which allows me to configure the way, like the authentication with my service bus relay. That's the one thing. That can stay the same if you're always using the same namespace. Okay? What would change is this code here. Again, this is code that, in this sense, allows me to just pull some data. But let's say you want to pull from SharePoint or even add data to SharePoint. You could do either of those, right? So this is just not a pull model. You could push as well. Okay? So yes, the short answer is you have to change code, all right? But some of that code can remain the same and be configured and used over and over again because you're using the same namespace. And the same namespace, when I say namespace, that is this namespace here. Okay? That's my namespace. If I click on my namespace, you'll see that I've got some authentication, password, special key, blah-de-blah-de-blah. All right? It is a very interesting pattern. I know walking through it in 5 minutes doesn't always do it justice. You probably want to go through it and practice it. But it is kind of an interesting pattern. All right. Stop. Okay. Now, there's other possibilities here, right? It's not just about, leveraging WCF. I showed you a REST service. You can leverage REST as well, and we'll put one together in a little bit. But there's also things like you want to leverage XML and JSON. And as many of you know, it's not just about XML. More and more, as web developers, we're trying to figure out how to leverage JSON. So, integration of jQuery and AJAX and JSON kind of all working together is something that you'll probably come across when you're actually building out web parts and whatnot. Anybody here heard of JSON-P? A few of you. So if those of you who haven't, JSON-P is JSON with padding. What it allows you to do is, in essence, make cross-domain calls, right, in kind of a secure way. Or I wouldn't say in a secure way. You probably have to trust it. But what happens is you have this JSON-P, you have to kind of create a formatted header so you can reach out, and it injects script into your page. Now, personally, I get a little scared when some object is injecting script into my page. That's just me. You all, if you trust that endpoint, if you trust that service you're calling to inject goo into your page, then thumbs up to you. But you got to trust that endpoint, right? You got to make sure that that JSON-P is coming back and it's not going to rip your page apart. Okay? So that's just one caveat to JSON-P. There's a new thing called cross-origin resource sharing, which is an interesting thing. The only problem with CORS, it's supported in different ways across browsers, but essentially allows you to do the same thing. I could have a cross-domain call with some, just kind of setting an asterisk on my header inside of my message return from my service. That allows anybody to call me and return that data. My point being is there's multiple ways to skin the cat if you're building services that are interacting with external data cross-domain. Could be REST, could be WCF, could have a JSON call, JSON-P, could be CORS. According to my colleague, Paul in the back, CORS is what everybody's doing these days. It's kind of the movement because it's a little easier and it's at the browser level as opposed to doing all this code and adding classes to format data that's coming back from your service calls. Okay? This is just an example of JSON-P versus CORS. So if you're building out, let's say, something that would be doing a cross-domain call, you can see that I've got a service there that question mark callback equals question mark is basically just handling a JSON-P callback, injecting some script into your page, and of course it's going to run that when it hits your page. And of course the data.name is basically just taking one element of an object and exposing that in an alert. But obviously you'd have some nice formatting HTML goo that you'd put in there to take that and do something with it on your page. The point being, if I had lob data over here in a cross-domain, a hybrid app would be taking that through this JSON-P mechanism and exposing it in a web part with jQuery, which is perfectly plausible. And this, you can see the CORS down below is much more efficient on the server side, right? You build your service, deploy it. You've got this little header that you set, asterisk that you set. But again, multiple browsers support it differently. There's a great post here on CORS and Web API. So if you want to learn more, I would definitely go there. All right. Cloud and device. So this is where we kind of talk a bit more about the REST side of things, right? Remember, we're going to come back to that REST service and the data I showed you before. If we think about common patterns, there's a number of different patterns that you can build. Some of them are, most of them are service mediated actually, but some of them can be authenticated and secured as well. Okay? And in reality, you've got, kind of the top layer there. It could be anything. It could be a device, or it could be a browser on all of them. But at the bottom, you can see that in some cases, I just want to talk directly with my database, or I want to talk through a service, and I can even kind of talk with Microsoft Dynamics CRM or some other lob system as well. And I can do it in an authenticated way. It gets trickier and trickier. So many of you who have kind of delved into the identity side of building custom apps and trying to integrate it with SharePoint Online, you know that there's no claims passing, right, which is kind of a pain. You know, there's ADFS federation from on-premises to the cloud, awesomeness, but then I can't take an SB user, hang a claim off it, and throw it into Azure, right? So hopefully that'll change moving forward, but that's one limitation that you do have to deal with. And certainly, you know, it's a tough one. But there are ways of getting around it. One way you'll see is creating a service, a secure service, where you pass the username and password and have an SSID or an app ID that allows you to kind of handle that. So there are ways of getting around it, but there's no perfect picture right now. So for this one, think about SharePoint Online. It's basically consuming a web service, and I'm going to interact with some lob data that's sitting in SQL database, which is my hybrid app. And of course, we'll go ahead and we'll expose that out to a device. Okay? You can see my data will flow, and everybody's going to be happy. Okay? So first of all, there's two sides to this, right? The first is, let's go ahead and talk about the service first. Oh, before I do this, any questions? Again, you know, I know that half you developers, half you aren't, so I'm living a lot in code here. This is a 300-level session, but any questions while I'm kind of going through this? You guys all comfortable with me kind of doing Visual Studio stuff here? Yes, sir. Sure. That's a great question. So the question was, how does the Silverlight know? Basically, if you go back into, let's go here into Home, that'll load a little quicker. And we go into Edit the Page. Basically, there's a couple things. I put my Silverlight application. You can put it in two places. Here you can see I've got this Zaps folder. If you were to click that Zaps folder, you see all my Zaps. And the Zap is basically just a built Silverlight app. Okay? This is total demoware. If I were in production, I probably would put it in a client bin or a hidden part of SharePoint on premises. In the context of SharePoint Online, you probably want to put it in an assets folder. But what you do is you put it here, right? Now what I've got is if I go into add, let's see, insert a web part. Add a web part here. And this is the same irrespective of whether it's in SharePoint Online or SharePoint on premises. Click Silverlight web part. Click Add, and then basically add a URL. I'm just copied and paste the URL from my Zaps folder into there, and it loads it up. So basically, wherever it puts your Silverlight app, in SharePoint Online or in SharePoint, you just have to make sure you have that link to it. There's other ways to do it as well. There's, I think, out on the SharePoint tools on Visual Studio Gallery, there's things that you can get where it basically deploys it automatically and surfaces it for you. So there's a number of different ways to leverage Silverlight. So Silverlight's not quite dead yet. So does that answer your question? Yeah. And of course, because the Silverlight's calling the service, it's all embedded in the Silverlight app. It's self-contained. But again, remember we have this thing called the client object model. So you can integrate and interact with SharePoint Online or SharePoint on premises. Whatever you want. Okay. So let's jump back here. I was going to talk a bit about this guy here. So again, on the right-hand side, you can see I've got a service, and this service is very simple. It basically interacts with my grades entity, which is basically a SQL database. Okay? It's living in Azure, but basically to surface it inside of SharePoint Online, I need to wrap that SQL database with a service of some sort. Okay? There's no direct connection from SPO, SharePoint Online, to a SQL database today. I doubt there ever will be, just because of some of the denial of service attacks guards that are built into the SQL Azure experience. Okay? And you can see here, I've got two methods, right? I've got, let me see here, I've got get grades, and I've got get class grade. Okay? Can anybody tell me why I just have two methods, or why I need two methods? One that gets everything and one that just gets with one parameter? Gets one single entity? I'll tell you why. Because in SharePoint Online and an external list, which is what we're going to build, it requires a minimum of a read list and a read item. Okay? You have to have those two things if you're going to build out a list in SharePoint Online. And so fundamentally, I'm modeling those two method calls here inside my service. Okay? Then, of course, I've wrapped it. Just go here, publish it. And that's going to take me into my site over here. And we can go back and let me see here. I believe here's my grades lob service here. And I would go down here and just click on that. However, I think I'd have my desktop. All right. Here it is, grade service. There's the grade service. You can see there's the namespace is in the cloud. Now at this point, what I would do is I would go into my SharePoint Online site. And here it is here. And I would go ahead and I'd open up SharePoint Designer. So this is kind of a two-step development process, right? You build the service, deploy the service, then you have to create the ECT, external content type, inside of SharePoint Online using SharePoint Designer. This is actually one of the really cool things. That it's really easy to create these things. I'm not going to go all the way through it again. There's tons of prescriptive guidance out there for this type of thing. But I'll just kind of get you started here by showing I click on external content types. And I go ahead, and you can see that I've actually already got it here, but as soon as this shows up, click on external content types. If I click on external content types, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So here, I'll just show you right quick here. You can see that when I open up this external content type, oh, now it shows up. Now it goes away. You can see here that on the right-hand side, or down here in the middle here, you can see that I've created an external content type. You just walk through a wizard, plug in the WSDL and the endpoint, and allows you to build out these things here. Again, super easy stuff. It's out there on the web already. If I could, there we go. Now I'll just do it right quick here. New external content type, foo, bar, foo. The important thing is this here. So I add a connection. We're going to do WCF service, click OK. And this is where I put the metadata URL. Okay? Boom. Everybody's happy. And once I've done that, I just create a list and form that will basically create a list for me, which is, that's not it there. That's this guy here. Okay? And so what happens is, what's going on right now, it's calling get all grades. Calling the service which interacts with my SQL database, pulls the database, the lob info back, exposes it in SharePoint Online. Or if I want to go ahead and say, hey, I just want to view that item, it takes that one ID as a parameter, goes through, and gets the single entity in my database and pulls it back. Okay? Now, the thing is, you might be asking, well, do I have to interact with SQL databases? No. Your data could be anything. You're modeling it with a service. You just have to make sure you model it correctly through the WCF wrapper, and that's what you expose to SharePoint Online. Okay? So that's totally insecure, and we can go back here and actually code against this. This, again, I've showed this before, but I'll just for giggles, again, this is, jQuery, not Silverlight, so this is jQuery. And I actually really like jQuery because of all the libraries that comes with it. It's actually pretty cool. Lots of good stuff there. And this just says, hey, I've got my external list using JavaScript, jQuery, and the client object model. I can code against it. And I can make this thing look fancy. Fancy lists. That's what we all aspire to, right? All right. And so the other thing, though, is I can use this to create secure grades as well. If we go ahead, and I'll just show you one real quick thing here, is, let me go back to my desktop. I think it's here. Secure grades, there we go. Secure grades, you do much the same thing, but you do one thing differently. In the spirit of trying to lock things down, what you need to do here is you need to add kind of a username and password. And here, what we've got is similar type service, but I've got an identity provider here somewhere. Let's see where my service is. See if I can find, there it is. Identity, user authentication. Here, what I'm doing is I'm passing in a username and password. And this is a class that I register in my web.config. And so when my web.config and my service are deployed, and then I do my external content type, it'll prompt me for that username and password. I put it in, and now it's securely tied to my Windows Azure and my BCS. And what you also need is client certificates. I have a 96-page hands-on lab on my blog that will walk you through how to do this. 96 pages. It'll only take you like 3 hours of your time, okay? Maybe 4. but it's good fun. But the point is, it's obviously a common request. We want to make sure that you can lock down and have some sense of authentication in your service, and this is one way of doing it. And again, the experience, once you've kind of deployed it, is very much the same as you saw before. There's my secure grades. Here, in fact, I've got more methods, that I've built. I can view it, I can edit it, and I can delete it. I got full CRUD operations, all secure. Now, you probably don't want to have edit grade capability for your students on their SharePoint Online site. You probably just want them to be able to view. That's a great school that you'd want to go to, right? If you could edit your own grades, that'd be awesome. But unfortunately, this is an example, though, where you could have credit if you wanted to. So, any questions on what you just saw there? You guys are speechless or just bored? You're planning your weekend already? All right, let's go back. All right, so again, when we think about this service wrapper, there's lots of different endpoints that you could point to. You want to probably get away from having a service wrapper on a service wrapper on a service wrapper. You just have daisy-chained performance issues. But you can throw OData kind of endpoints and REST endpoints and lots of different things that you can wrap those guys around. So lots of stuff that you can do there. All right? Lots of samples and resources out there. So lots of good stuff there. This is the last kind of demo and scenario I'll walk through. It's kind of a cool one. This is where, hey, I have virtual machine. Okay? And this is where I have a server that I've stood up in the cloud, and I've got my server here. And I'm going to use the service bus relay pattern. Remember I showed you that with SharePoint Online? Now I'm going to show you where you can have a hybrid app where you're kind of talking to that service bus relay, but with 2 VMs. Okay? Now the pattern here, in essence, is pretty simple. You've got this guy over here in the cloud, and this guy here on premises. And they're just going to talk by virtue of this service bus relay. Okay? So let's go over here. Here we go. Here's my remote server. Basically, if we go ahead and look at this in our management portal, we can see that we've got virtual machines running. Go back, cloud services, virtual machines. That's this guy here. I would click connect. I would get into it. But in essence, it's a server, just like I'd be running underneath my desk, except I've taken it, moved it into the cloud. All right? The nice thing here is I can basically go ahead. Here's that same application that leverages the service that's sitting inside of Windows Azure. I can pull it and consume it inside of this VM. Likewise here, remember that on-premises lob kind of service bus relay app I showed you how to build? Well, if we go ahead, let's do this first. Fire that back up. Fire the data service, debug it. Let it run for just a second and warm up. And just so that you know, we'll be finishing up pretty soon. I know you guys got lunch after this. So, all right, and here we go. It's ready to go. Click data. Let's just go back and make sure this guy gets called. There we go. It's getting called, and that'll expose it out. This is from a completely different machine on a different domain, but authenticating using that service bus relay. Pretty cool, huh? So you can do a lot of different things with Azure through this different method of authentication and service bus communication. Okay? All right, so in the spirit of getting you out of here so you can go and enjoy lunch, let me just close down with a few things here. There's some write-ups and samples and good stuff there. I just want to close down with a few words on identity security. Oh, I'm so sorry about this. This is so annoying. There's a lot of different elements there that you can use. UAG. Azure has some different elements. Again, if you think about the SP user and claim, I think that's one of the major drawbacks. It doesn't support claims in SharePoint Online. But there are other things that you can do to get around that. If we think about one, which is headless authentication, has anybody here tried out headless authentication? No? Okay, this is an interesting one. This allows you to basically reach into SharePoint Online from the outside. Yikes, right? And basically what I can do is I can deploy some artifact into Azure that reaches back and does some goo. Now, this is not going to be a really fancy demo, but this will show you that if we go into, where is it here? This guy here. Basically what we've got, this is a very simple application. You can see that I've got a SharePoint site, a username, and a password. And what that means is I can pass the site, a username and password from a service and get into SharePoint Online and throw some stuff in it or get some stuff out. Remember, whatever's inside of your service, you can execute given an account that allows you to do that. And so through cookies and claims and things like that, you can then use the client object model to go ahead and execute that code, okay, or interact with the site. And so what this is going to do, and there's a great write-up on this, but let me see, I think it's the helper function here. There's a bunch of goo in here. I'm not going to go through this, but you can see it's like cookies, cookie container, blah-de-blah-de-blah, good stuff, right? When we go ahead and hit F5, you'll see that what happens here, this will go through, and that is the demo. How impressive is that? Pretty sad. But what it's doing, though, what's really interesting, what it's doing, it's going through, let me see here, and again, it's executing that program here, which is this guy right here. It's just getting the title using the client object model inside of an application. But you could put this as a service and then have it talking through. Now, this is dangerous, right? But it's one way of interacting in a secure way with SharePoint Online. And you can imagine kind of having a workflow that lives in Windows Azure, reaching through, adding a list item, that spawns an internal workflow. You can do some pretty interesting things with this, right? So I would just caution you to, maybe do some research on it, and you never know when that the SharePoint Online services are going to change that. There's a couple good posts from Chris Johnson, and of course, lots of good stuff there. So lastly, on identity, I hesitate to show you this slide because it's almost overwhelming with the different options that you may have to contend with. But this is cloud computing. Right now, today, we don't have this one single sign-on to the cloud experience yet. It'd be great if we had Vault. You put your finger, have a little biometric analysis of your eye, and all of a sudden, boom, your services works across everywhere in the web. That's not the case. Okay? You will come across Active Directory. You will come across managing Office Live IDs, WIF, OAuth, BCS, et cetera, et cetera. Shared access permissions is on a blob in Azure Storage. So there's lots of options here. I also have a hands-on lab with taking SP user and mapping that to shared access permissions, which is kind of cool. So if if someone wants that, you can reach out to me. I'll give you that. So lots of good stuff. I think this slide kind of summarizes what I was showing you for the most part. If we start from the top and go down to the bottom, I walked you through a scenario that synchronized data from on-premises to the cloud, right? We consumed that in SharePoint Online. I showed you later on through that service. And we can consume it via REST service. I don't have time to show you that, but basically, through a phone. Service bus, showed you that. I didn't show you virtual machine connectivity, or at least the VM, the secure machine connectivity. I just didn't want to do that. Today I didn't have time. And the virtual machine I showed you at the end. So the point is, you've got lots of options to build hybrid apps. Hybrid is a pretty open, and overloaded term in some sense. But in my mind, it kind of brings together parts of your on-premises system with devices, with data that may live in the cloud. With SharePoint Online, it's kind of that common experience, that brings it together. And I realized I wasn't kind of spending a whole bunch of time on SharePoint Online, but that's the point, okay? SharePoint Online is your kind of point of collaboration. You know it and love it. The question is, how do we use the web and how to use the cloud and Windows Azure to augment that in a custom solution way, to bring these other data elements into that experience? So that's what I was trying to focus on today and hopefully achieve that. And of course, differentiation. Lots of things you can do with across these three different areas of Windows Azure. Again, reinforcing the idea, I think today, I've been talking about SharePoint and Azure for about 1.5 years now. Finally feel more and more comfortable with where we're at from the cloud platform and where we're at with SharePoint plugging into it and vice versa. Okay? So with that, lots of stuff, call to action, 5 minutes left. That'll give you plenty of time to run down and get your grub. But, feel free to reach out to me. stefox@microsoft.com is my email address. Always happy to answer questions. I try and post on my blog regularly when I find something interesting or we discover something that would be worth it to share with you, the community. But there's some cool stuff here that you may want to take advantage of. And I think with that, let me first say thank you very much. You have a lot of choices here at TechEd. So I appreciate you spending the hour and a quarter with me. I'll hang out for questions up here. But, other than that, thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of the week.